Hello friends, today let's take a look at the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats, written by W.H. Auden. Now W.H. Auden is Wystan Hugh Auden, an English poet who was very popular in the 1920s and 30s. He was born in 1907 in the place called York in England, and he was educated at the Oxford University. And he says that he was born into a Tennysonian world, a world that was dominated by the ideas and which was held under the charisma of the great poet Tennyson. But then as he grew up, there was a lot of change happening. We had T.S. Eliot bringing in his masterpiece work, The Wasteland, and we saw the world slowly drifting into the modernist style of writing. World, I am talking about the literary world. And so he was born in a Tennysonian world, but then he grew up imbibing all these modernist attitudes and techniques. And in his early works, he was quite enamored with modernism. But later on, he moved away from it. He kind of went back to a kind of traditional way of writing, and he felt that the obscurity of modernism was sometimes a little too much, and so he detached himself from the experimental false start, because he said that he himself doesn't recognize what he wrote at the beginning. And so he embraced a more traditional set of poetic forms. But then, since he lived in a milieu of modernism, he couldn't help expressing some of his ideas in a modernist way. And so you can see that he's not always very straightforward. Sometimes he too is quite obscure. When you read his poems, there are lines and stanzas which you find very difficult to interpret. So though that is there, he kind of rejected modernism and the love of the modernist love of obscure illusion, and he tried to keep his poetry more traditional. And he did a lot of odd jobs in England, where he was born. He taught in schools and such things, and then later on in 1939 he left England and migrated to the US. That was in 1939, and that was just a year before the Second World War broke out. Of course, the pressure was building up, and it was at that time that he left for the States. And so many people considered that as a very irresponsible act of desertion, leaving one's country when one is in trouble. But then he generally did not support the idea of war and violence. He had his own reasons to go, and so he went away, and he spent the rest of his life in the US, and of course he traveled quite a lot, and he also had a vacation home, a holiday home in Austria, where he used to go every year to take some time off, and it was in this place that he died in 1973. Now that is about W.H. Auden. Now coming to the poem that we are going to discuss, it is titled In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Okay, now who is this W.B. Yeats? Now when you see the spelling of Yeats, and maybe some of you have been reading this as Yeats, just like you would read K-E-A-T-S as Keats, but then you should remember that this word is pronounced not as Yeats, it is Yeats. And often my students, when I value the papers, I often see them making a very amusing spelling mistake. Many of them write yeast instead of Yeats, Y-E-A-S-T. So students of literature, beware, do not make any such mistakes. Be careful about the spelling and give attention to the pronunciation, and read it as Yeats. Now, W.B. Yeats is William Butler Yeats. He was an English poet born in Ireland, very close to. So he's considered as one of the chief names in Irish literature, Irish English literature, and he made a remarkable contribution to literature. And in Ireland, he was very actively involved in what you would call the Celtic revival, in bringing back the Irish ballads and Irish folk songs, writing about Irish mythology. So he was a very prominent person, a very powerful person too. And he won, W.B. Yeats won the Nobel Prize in 1923. Now, Yeats died at the age of 73 in 1939. So this particular poem, In Memory of W. Yeats, was written, as the title says, in memory of W.B. Yeats, and this is an elegy, but it's a very unconventional kind of an elegy. When you make a comparison of this elegy with In Memoriam or Lycidas, you will find that it is very different. But then it is one of the most popular elegies that, elegies written in English literature. So this poem is divided into 3 sections. Section 1 has 6 stanzas, and of these 6, the first 5 are stanzas which have 6 lines each, and the last stanza of section 1 is just 2 lines. Section 2 is just a single stanza of 10 lines. Section 3, you have again 6 stanzas, 4 lines each, and only the last section has a rhyme pattern. It rhymes AABB. I'll mention that rhyme pattern once again when we're doing section 3. So now let's begin with section 1. The first stanza. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. Okay, so that's the first stanza. He disappeared in the dead of winter. Now, Yeats died on January 28th in 1939. He died when he was in France, and the time of his death was around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And so January, of course, in the northern hemisphere, it is the time of winter. That is why he disappeared in the dead of winter. It only says here he disappeared. We don't know who this is, in the sense that at least the name is not mentioned. We know that it is Yeats because the title says that very clearly. But here the poet doesn't mention any name. He says he disappeared in the dead of winter. And it was very cold. All the brooks which usually flow in a very icy manner, they were all frozen. The airports were deserted. And the snow disfigured the public statues. It means the snow had accumulated on the statues, and there was some snow at some places the snow had fallen. So the statues were all disfigured. They looked ugly and dirty. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree that. So he says that the mercury sank means the temperature. That is what is meant there. So the temperature was very low, and all instruments that we have, all these instruments that measure the temperature, have recorded that day, the day of his death, was a dark, cold day. So you can see that first stanza gives us a feeling of immense cold, and it matches the tone of the poem where, now this is an elegy where the poet is talking about the death of a person. So death always is associated with cold, just like life is associated with warmth. So here you can feel the presence of death because everywhere it is cold. Second stanza. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The Peasant River was untempted by the fashionable quays. By mourning tongues, the death of the poor was kept from his poems. So here in the next stanza he says, now Yeats was ill and finally he succumbed to his illness, but the fact or the truth that Yeats was ill and he was nearing death or that he died was not known to the rest of the world. In the sense, he is telling us that life went on as it usually does. It is not as if the whole world suddenly came to a standstill with the death of this one person. That is why, far from his illness, the wolves ran on. So in the forests, the wolves continued to run and move about doing their activities. The Peasant River was untempted by the fashionable quays. Quay, Q-U-A-Y-S. A quay is a kind of, at the harbor or by the riverside, you would find a kind of a wooden platform, wooden or a concrete platform that stretches into the water. That is where the ships or boats would come and come closer to the shore. So that place is the quay. And so he says the Peasant River means, I guess what he means is that Peasant River means rivers that start flowing from some villages or from some rustic places. Rivers which originated in some interior highlands or some such place, and these rivers are flowing down to the fashionable quays. You have fashionable quays in big cities. So he is talking about the flow of the river from some distant rustic place right through the cities. So fashionable quays, I guess, symbolizes the city. So what he's telling us is the wolves continue to run, the rivers continue to flow. Nothing has altered the routine of any other thing happening in nature. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. And again, his poems too, Yeats's poems too, were unaware of the fact that their creator had died. It is not as if his poems too disappeared with his death. They were unaware that the poet had died. Now let me just remind you that the poet Auden is essentially a modern poet, and so though he rejected the obscure allusions of modernism, in some places he, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, becomes quite obscure himself. And in many places when you read this poem and other poems, you would really be a little confused as to what exactly the poet meant by the word that he used or the idea that he expresses. So and you do not find any satisfying explanations elsewhere. So then the only thing that I can do now is to give an interpretation which I find suitable. And again, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Now here in this line and in other places in this particular poem, we are reminded of the new critics. This was the time of new criticism, and where people were talking about ideas like the death of the author. You know what that means, isn't it? Basically, it means that once a work is created or once a writer writes something, there is this impersonality. T.S. Eliot also has spoken about this impersonality theory, that a writer is detached from his work. It is a lot of other things, his historical sense and his experiences, the collective consciousness. All these act and all these are instrumental in the creation of a certain work. And the poet or the author has the least to do with his work. And so the death of the author means that once a work is produced, the author is dead, because then the work is in the hands of others. It is the reader who takes on from there and he interprets it as he understands. So the writer doesn't have much control over his work once it is released. So here, the death of the poet was kept from his poems too, may reflect that idea that the poet Yeats died, but his poems continued. His poems were not aware that this man had died. So here, another thing to be mentioned about this particular stanza, this thing about how though this man was lying dead, or maybe he was nearing his death, but the rest of the world continued as it, it continued with its usual routine. This idea is presented in yet another very famous poem of W.H. Auden, the poem called Muse des Beaux Arts. So there again you have this same theme, the theme of how life flows unrestricted. The death or disappearance of one person doesn't matter at all to the others. Only when something happens to people who are directly linked to you, your relative, your parent, or your friend, only then it affects you. Otherwise, we don't really bother. That's how it is. You read about something in the newspaper. For a moment, you might say, "Oh my God, how sad," and then you go on with your life. So, such individual occurrences affect only individuals. It doesn't in any way disrupt the flow of the world. So that is the idea. So in the poem Muse des Beaux Arts, there again he mentions about how that poem was inspired by a painting that he saw, a painting in a museum where it's a big canvas and you have the fall of Icarus. That is the painting, the fall of Icarus. And what happens in this? Now, who is Icarus, by the way? Icarus is again a mythical character who was the son of Daedalus. Daedalus was the architect of in ancient Greek stories. Something, whenever I think of Daedalus, I am reminded of Vishwakarma of our Indian mythology. And so this Daedalus was a master in his work, and he was asked to make a labyrinth. You know what a labyrinth is? A kind of a maze. Once you get in, you can't come out of it. That kind of a labyrinth. And he and his son, they were trapped in this labyrinth and they couldn't come out of it. And that is when Daedalus, he made wings. Because he was very creative and talented, he made wings with some feathers and wax, or all those things, and he attached the wings to himself and to his son, and the attempt was to escape from the labyrinth, so they flew out of the labyrinth. So that is how the story goes. And so he also warned his son Icarus, who was very young at that time, maybe a teenager or something, and so he told Icarus that he shouldn't fly too high, he shouldn't go too close to the sun, because then the wax would melt and he would fall down. But Icarus, as teenagers do, must have disobeyed his father's instructions, and he flew too high and his wings melted and he fell into the sea and he was drowned to death. That is the story. And so in that painting you can see the picture. You can, I think, see it, you can just search for it on Google and you will find the picture. There is this painting, The Fall of Icarus. You have, it's a large, kind of a very wide a picture, a panorama, and there is this water and you can see two legs. The rest of the body has already gone inside the water, two legs sticking out. Those are the legs of Icarus, and you can see a ship far away. You can see a big ship and it's just floating by, and here on the land you can see a man who is working in the fields. He is plowing his fields. So this picture, when Auden saw this picture, it is said that he was inspired to write a poem. And there again, this is one of the themes in that poem, where he says that life goes on. One man is falling into the water, he is drowning, and there is a ship going there. The people on the ship are totally unconcerned about this man. Maybe they didn't see him at all. So the ship is just sailing by, they are having a nice time in the ship. Here again there is a man who is working in his field. He too is not aware of what is happening to this Icarus. So that is how life is. When such things happen, it only affects a few people around you. The rest of the world will carry on with its functions. So that again Auden brings in here. Though the great poet Yeats had died, the world was unaware of it. Now the third stanza. But for him it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling failed, he became his admirers. I love that last part. He became his admirers. Okay, so now first he spoke about the death of this poet, and then in the next stanza he suddenly went away from the poet, the dead poet, and now in stanza 3 he comes back to Yeats and he says, for him, no matter what happened to the rest of the world, for him, for the dying poet, that was his last afternoon as himself, because that was the last few moments when his soul would be inside his body. Okay, so his last afternoon as himself, and it was an afternoon of nurses and rumours. Why? Because he was hospitalized and the nurses were kind of running around him. You can imagine the commotion in a hospital when a patient is dying. Especially if it is a very famous person, there would be all kind of rumors. The people standing outside would wonder whether he is dead or what is happening to him. So all kind of rumors would be spread. So that is by an afternoon of nurses and rumors. And in the meantime, what was happening to Yeats? He was dying slowly, slowly. He was succumbing to death. So that is why the provinces of his body revolted. So his whole body, you can see, there is a metaphor here. His body is compared to a big, maybe a stretch of land, a state or a country, and the provinces. And so the provinces of his body revolted. Means he was having trouble, he was ill, and it is said that in the afternoon the doctor, because he was in great difficulty, that is Yeats was in great difficulty, and the doctor prescribed morphine so that he can, the pain can be diminished, and slowly, very slowly, he succumbed to a very peaceful death. So the different parts of his body, they revolted because of ill health. He had trouble with different parts of his body, and slowly they all revolted and they gave up the fight. The squares of his mind were empty. So squares, we are talking about the squares or the places where you have the square. In every city or a town you have a place where some kind of a program is organized, a place where people can gather. So that is the square. So his mind was slowly getting emptied because he was dying. Silence invaded the suburbs. Suburbs are the parts of a city that are a little away from the city. Okay, so silence invaded the suburbs means slowly, little by little, his body surrendered to death. The current of his feeling fade. You can see that very gradual progression, or slowly the movement of death, or death taking over. The current of his feeling failed, and finally what happened? The current of his feeling failed. That is the life current that was flowing through his limbs and his body, through his veins. It slowly stopped. The current of his feeling failed. That means that life ebbed out of him. His life blood or whatever just emptied out of him, and the current of his feeling failed, and he became his admirers. So that's why I told you that last part is beautiful, because he says here that he became his admirers. So the poet Yeats finally gave himself up to death, and from then onwards there is no Yeats the man. He became his admirers, because from then onwards Yeats would live only in the minds of his admirers, his readers and his critics. So that is why he became his admirers. You remember the first line of that stanza? What does it say? But for him it was his last afternoon as himself. So once he is dead, he is not himself anymore. And what does he become? He became his admirers. The next stanza. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So now he is scattered among 100 cities. Means now the man called Yeats, he is scattered in 100 cities, in the sense like we have this right of some people express the desire that once they die, their ashes should be strewn over cities or taken to different, you give various desires, your death wishes. So now in Yeats's case, he died actually in this place called Rockburn. So now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given. So here that means that hereafter, once Yeats is dead, he continues to live in the minds and hearts of people living in various cities. That is why now he is scattered among 100 cities. Now this reminds me of some extra information that I read when I was preparing for this poem. Yeats died in France in a place called Roquebrune, and before his death he told his wife that when I die, you can bury me in the church here, the place called Roquebrune, and then after a year, when the press forgets about me, you dig me up and take me to the Drumcliff Church in Sligo in Ireland. That was his favorite place, and so that was the instruction he left his wife, that he should be buried there in France in the nearby church called Roquebrune. And after a year, because he is a very famous man, and he knew that when he dies for a long time, there would be a lot of discussion about him, and so he said, let all that die down. After 1 year, you exhume my body and take it and bury it in Drumcliff Church in Sligo. But then what happened was that his wife, her name was Georgie and he called her George, so his wife wanted to follow the instructions, but unfortunately the World War II erupted, and then things didn't work out as she planned, and so it was after a long time, some 6-7 years or so, only after that she was able to take the remains of Yeats to Ireland. So a navy ship from Ireland was sent to carry his remains, and then he was buried once again in Ireland. There is a lot of controversy regarding this. Those who are interested can just try doing some reference to it. I'm not going into the details. So here now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness. So what the whole stanza, I'll just tell you the meaning of the stanza as a whole. So once he is dead, he is no longer in one place, his body is gone, and he is scattered in the sense he lives in the memories of people living in different places. His admirers might remember him with great love. His critics might talk about him. Students like us who read about him will continue to discuss about him. And so he is scattered among 100 cities. And he is given to unfamiliar affections, which means that he will be, people will interpret him in various ways. They might he would be read in places which he is not familiar with. People might interpret him in ways in which he never expected to. They might find meanings in his poems which he really didn't intend. Sometimes that happens. Like, again, you remember the death of the author idea. So all that can happen. That is why wholly given over to unfamiliar affection. Some people might like what he wrote, some people may not like what he wrote, some might criticize him, find fault with him. So he will be punished under a foreign code of conscience, which means that he would be subject to all kinds of judgments. People will judge him. People will blame him for things he did not do. People will applaud him for something that he did, or something that he didn't intend. So all that will happen. That is why punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So that means, again, once you are dead, especially if you are a writer or an artist, once you are dead, you have no control over your work of art. It will be interpreted and understood in very, very different ways. So that is why here it is said, the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Then, in the next stanza, stanza 5 of section 1, but in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. So he says that, again, from Yeats he goes on to the general. From the individual he moves on to the society, or from the particular he moves on to the general. We had this contrast earlier also, you remember? So this is what happened to Yeats, his last moments and how he died and all that. And now he says that tomorrow there would be a lot of noise, means the world will go on, the same idea recurring, okay? And then in the bourse is the stock exchange, okay? So there you will have people, brokers roaring like beasts. You must have seen videos of what happens at the stock exchange. You can see people shouting there, the brokers, like they've all gone mad. And if you don't know what's happening at the stock exchange, you will wonder what these people are shouting for. And then, so that will continue. That is, the daily activities of the world will continue undisturbed, even if Yeats has died. And the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. And the poor people will continue living through their sufferings because they are fairly accustomed, they are used to it. And each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. So each person lives in his own world. Cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. That is, every individual will go on with his existence because each person is a cell in himself, and he would think that he is free to do whatever he can. He is free to do whatever he wants to, and nestled in this false sense of freedom, each individual will continue to live. A few thousand will think. So he says, in spite of all this, a few people will remember this day. And who are these few people? Maybe the people who are admirers of Yeats, the people who like reading Yeats's poetry, who knew him as a person. A few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. So they will mark this day and keep it in their mind as a day which was slightly unusual. And then again, the last two lines of that section, he borrows the two lines from the first stanza and says, what instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So he ends section 1 with those two lines saying that it was a very, very cold day. So once again he establishes the coldness of death. So that is section 1.